Welcome back and welcome to part 3 of this Blender tutorial series where we're creating this low poly stylized forest river scene. Now if you haven't seen the previous parts, you can check out the tutorial playlist linked in the video description. So in this part we're going to be doing the environment. We're going to use geometry nodes to place the trees and grass and rocks on the ground, and then we'll be doing the animation, kind of animating the cameras, and then we'll do the rendering and the compositing and the video editing. And if you're interested in purchasing the tutorial project files, you can get those with the links in the description, and that's a great way to help support this channel. Now, one more thing before we start with this part, I wanted to let you know about my sci-fi construction robot Blender tutorial series. So it's an 11-part tutorial series. It's completely step-by-step and in real time, and throughout the tutorial series I show you how to create this sci-fi construction robot animation. And the tutorial covers the complete process, including modeling the robot, doing the materials and the lighting, and then also rigging the robot and doing the animation. So by the end of the tutorial series, you'll have this finished robot animation. If you're interested in learning more about the course, you can check out the product trailer video, and you can find the product pages linked in the description. So what I'm going to do is just open up the outliner here, and I'm just going to hide the cabin collection because we don't need those objects for now. Now here on the main collection, I'm going to double click on this, and I'm just going to call it scene because I like that better. This is going to have all the main objects for the environment. So let's start adding the ground plane. So I'll go to the add menu and we're just going to add a plane. I'm going to scale the plane up by 50, so it's pretty big, and then I will hit Control A and apply the scale. I'm now going to go into edit mode and I'm going to scale it along the x-axis, and I'll type 3 and then hit enter so it is much longer. And then I'll hit Control R to add a loop cut, and I'll scroll my mouse wheel until there are 2 loop cuts, and left click and right click so they stay in the center. So now these are about square shape. And I want them to be square shaped because when we subdivide this, I want the geometry to be more even. So we're now going to select everything, and we're going to use the object context menu, or you can also press Control E, and then you can click on subdivide. And then if you open up the subdivide settings here on the number of cuts, I'm going to turn this to 50 so it's very subdivided. So what I'm now going to do is go to the vertex select, and I'm going to hold down the Alt key and select that loop, and then Shift Alt select that loop, and I'll hit the O key to turn on proportional editing. And I'm now going to bring it down on the Z axis, and I'm going to scroll my mouse wheel to change the size of the proportional editing, and I'm just going to make it so the edges kind of come down because that's where it's going to go into the river. So I just want to bring them all down like that. Not too far, but just a little bit, maybe even a little bit more up. And then we can just go back to object mode. Now what I'm also going to do is go to the add menu, and we're going to add another plane, and I'm going to scale this plane up so it's really quite big. So make it pretty large like that, and maybe scale it out a bit, and then hit Control A and apply the scale. And I'm going to bring it down the Z axis like this. So now you can see the ground is going there into the water. And then I do want to do some basic sculpting to the landscape to make it look more random, but I first want to just add a few basic colors so we can kind of tell it apart. So what I'm going to do is go here to the materials, let's click on new, and I can call this river. And then here on the base color, I'm just going to make this for now just a very basic kind of like dark blue, and I'll hold down the Z button and go to the material preview so I can see that. Let's also hide this grid here, so if I click here on this drop down, I can hide the floor and the X and Y axis. Then I'll select the ground, we'll click on new, and I can just call this ground. And for this, I'm just going to make it kind of like an orangey color and then make it darker so it's kind of brown. So now I'm going to be sculpting this, so if I just select this object, we'll go from object mode over to sculpt mode. And I'm going to be using my drawing tablet for this, but you could definitely just use a mouse if you don't have a drawing tablet. I will, however, have some Amazon affiliate links in the description if you're interested in purchasing a drawing tablet, and the drawing tablet that I'm using is just this simple Wacom pad tablet. So here in sculpt mode, I'm just going to use the basic clay strips brush. I'm going to make my brush a bit bigger, and then I can hold down the control key and kind of sculpt in here to kind of push away the land, and then I can just sculpt here to bring out the land. So I'm going to make it kind of a little bit bumpy, and up here, kind of farther away from the river, I'm going to have it a bit higher. So I have it a bit higher over here, and then down here, kind of make it a little bit lower, kind of flatten it. And then you can also hold down the shift key to use the smooth brush, and I'm just going to kind of smooth this all out. Now what you can also do is hit the G key to go to the grab brush, and I'll make my radius bigger, and then I can just go along here and kind of bring the landscape in and out. Kind of on the back here, I might just kind of pull it out a little bit as well, and maybe smooth this out and then make it a bit more round and random. And the camera view is mostly going to be kind of like right down here, so kind of take a look at that and make sure that it looks good from that kind of angle. I might zoom way out and kind of pull everything a little bit farther away, kind of pull this up here, but I still want the landscape to be going down into the water. And then just kind of make it a bit more random, kind of going back and forth, so it just looks more natural. And so it's going to be pretty simple. I'm not going to do much more than that, so that's going to be it for the basic landscape. So let's change this back over to object mode, and I'll save the project again. So let's now just make the materials look a little bit better. So I'm going to click over here to go to the shading workspace, and I'm going to zoom out here, and I'm going to go into the rendered viewport mode. And also, again, I don't really want to see that grid there, so if I scroll over here and go to the show overlays, let's turn off the floor and turn off the axes there, because I just like that a bit better. So right now it's pretty dark, you can't see things too well, and one reason for that is that we don't actually have the sunlight in our scene. So if we just open this up here, open up the outliner, I believe in the cabin collection the sun was put in the cabin collection. So let's take the sun and we're going to drag it and drop it here into the scene collection, and then I can hide the cabin. So now we have this sunlight here, which is kind of lighting it up, and it looks like kind of that evening sunlight. So we'll select the plane and let's change the materials a bit. So I'm going to have it be a pretty dark gray, so I'm just going to go with this dark color here, and also if you want to punch in the same hex value, you can punch in that same value. And then here on the roughness, I'll turn this up to a 0.8 because I want it to be pretty rough. Now also to make this look more low poly and stylized, I'm going to be adding the decimate modifier to it so that it's a bit low poly. So let's just click over here to go to the modifiers. We'll click on add modifier, and I can add the decimate modifier. So now if I just drag the ratio down, if I go into the wireframe view, you can kind of see what it's doing. So if I drag the ratio down, it's going to make it look more low poly, just kind of give it a low poly style. So I'm just going to make it a bit more low poly, maybe just a little bit less like that. And then I will just click on the drop down and apply it. So now if we go into edit mode, you can see it's more low poly, and it kind of has that low poly style. Now also in the rendered view, I'm going to select the object here of the river, and let's change the river material. So for this material, I'm going to make it a really nice dark blue color, and here's the hex value if you want to copy the same hex value I'm using. And on the roughness, I'm going to turn this all the way to 0, so it looks really shiny and reflective. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to be mixing in a texture to make it look a bit more noisy and kind of add ripples on the surface. So I'm going to search for a noise texture. We'll drop it here, and then with the noise texture selected, I'll hit Ctrl T to add the texture coordinate and mapping, and we want to plug the object into the vector. So it's using object coordinates. So now we can take the noise texture factor and we can put that into the normal to give it some bump, but to convert this to proper normal data, we need to search for a bump node and put it between the noise and the principled. And then the factor can go into the height value. So now you can see it looks really noisy. So let's now change the settings. So on the 3D here, I'm going to change it to 4D instead. And with the 4D, if I just kind of zoom in here so you can kind of see it a little bit better, you can now see if I take the W value and kind of drag it around, it kind of looks like the water is kind of rippling. And so we're going to be using this W value, and we're going to be animating this to kind of give a cool effect. So for now, we'll just leave the W value at 0, and then I can turn the scale down to like a 0.2. Let's also turn the detail up to 4, so it's a little bit more detailed, but I don't want it to be too detailed because it is kind of stylized. And then the distortion, I'll turn to a 0.3. Now here on the bump strength, I'm going to turn this down to a 0.04, so it's much more subtle. So it is pretty subtle, but I just want it to be pretty smooth. It's going to be a pretty smooth river. Also on the roughness here, let's go into the noise texture roughness and turn this to like a 0.6, so it's just slightly more detailed. Let's save the project again, and we can go back here to the layout, and let's go into the rendered viewport mode. So I now want to add in the cabin, so let's just click here to uncheck the cabin collection, and I'll just drag it right up here right after the scene collection. And it's a little bit laggy in the viewport, so I'm going to go back into solid view, and we're going to select the empty here, and we're going to move this over. Actually, since the cabin is already right here and the dock is right here, what I'm going to do is just box select the other 3 objects, so the light and the river and the ground, and let's just move them back a bit on the y-axis. And then we could also maybe move the entire thing over a little bit and bring it over. So we're just going to have the cabin kind of right there on the ground. So if I just select the empty, which is controlling the cabin, I can just move the cabin and just kind of stick it here on the ground. Now you can see that the ground is going through the cabin, so I'm going to fix that by just kind of flattening the ground. But first, let's just place these objects. So I'm going to hold down the shift key, select these objects, and kind of move them over here. You can kind of scale them up a bit if you want to. And we're just going to stick this here and maybe rotate it on the z-axis and just stick it here on the end there of the land. And maybe if you want to, you could also bring the ground object up or bring the river object up so the river is just a little bit higher. All right, so that's looking pretty good. I like how that is. Let's maybe select the object here, which is controlling the house or the cabin, and maybe scale it up a little bit. Let's now select the ground and we'll go into edit mode. We're going to go to the face select and I'll just click and drag to box select all the ground here, which is underneath the house. And I'm going to scale it on the z-axis and we'll just scale it way down so it's much more flat. And then I can bring everything down on the z-axis to kind of just bring it down, maybe scale it again on the z-axis. And you could also type in 0 and then enter so it's even more flat, and then just bring it down a bit. And then also right here, if you want to just go to the edge select and select some of these edges, you can bring the edges down so that it goes back there into the river. And maybe bring this back a little bit because now it's a little bit too far out. So just use proportional editing to kind of pull that around. Maybe pull this back a little bit, just like that, and that's looking a lot better. So we now have a really nice flat spot for the cabin to sit on. So let's now add a camera in our scene. So I'll go to the add menu and I can just add a camera, and I'm gonna zoom my camera kind of to about over here, and I'll hit Control Alt Numpad 0. So Control Alt Numpad 0 will bring the camera to my view. And then if I select the camera, I can hit G to grab, kind of pull it around. Now what I can also do, which will make it a little bit easier, is if I hit the N key to open up the side panel, I'm gonna go here to view, and then I can click on the camera to view. And this way I can just move my view how I normally would, and that's gonna move the camera around. If you're kind of thinking about the rule of thirds, I kind of want the cabin to be kind of in this rule of thirds. So if you can imagine a line here splitting the camera, and then a line here, and then another line in the middle, I want the cabin to be kind of on this third line. So just kind of stick it right there so it's in the rule of thirds, and then we're going to have kind of a nice composition with kind of the background and the trees, then the river's here, and then the cabin will be right there. And then we can uncheck the camera to view and just close the side panel. And we'll go into the rendered viewport mode to see how that's looking. Now I also want to turn up the focal length of the camera. So if I select the camera and go to the object data properties, I'm going to turn the focal length up to 70, and then I'll hit G to grab, and I'll double tap the Z key, and I'll drag the camera back here, and also bring the camera over, just kind of drag the camera to a better spot, maybe rotate it a little bit. But I think turning the focal length up to 70 just makes things look a bit nicer. So we are going to be adding another landscape in the background later, but first I want to set up the geometry nodes here on this object. So we're going to select the ground object, and we'll click here to go to the geometry nodes workspace. I'll go into the camera view and just kind of zoom in here so I can kind of see this. Let's just make this a bit smaller, and also we'll make the side panel smaller so we have more space here. So let's click on new to add new geometry nodes, and we're first going to be adding in the grass. So we'll just call this geo nodes grass. And then also if I open up the side panel here, I'm also going to rename the geometry nodes modifier so it's called geo nodes grass. So let's now add the two main nodes, which we're going to use to distribute the grass on the plane. So if we go to the add menu, we can search for the distribute points on faces. And what this is going to do is going to make random little points, which are just going to be randomly placed on the faces of the object. So you can kind of see what we're getting, just all these little dots here, and that's just telling us where the points are. Now what we want to do is we want to instance or place the grass on those points. So we're going to search for the instance on points. So now what we can do is we can plug the grass collection here into the instance. First, what I want to do is change the random to Poisson disk, and that way there's going to be a little bit of space in between each one of the points if we turn up the distance min value. So here on the density max, I'll turn this to a 0.1 for now so it's really small. So now let's go to the add menu, and we're going to search for collection, and we're going to add the collection info. And we can put the instance here into the instance on points. Now to actually have the grass show up, we need to click on the collection and we need to choose the grass. Now you can see if I just go into the rendered view or material preview, you can see there's little bits of grass placed on the ground. Now the ground is invisible, and that's because we need to add the original geometry back into the node setup. So what we're going to do is search for a join geometry and stick it here after the instance on points, and the geometry can go here into the join geometry. I'll just drag this up here, and I can see we have the original plane back again. And also I'm going to click here again, and I'm just going to hide those overlays because I don't really like those overlays in the scene. So now if I zoom in here, let's just zoom into the part which is kind of lighter like that. You can now see we have just little bits of grass placed on the plane. Now it's still a little bit hard to see the grass, so what I'm going to do is go into the material preview, and then if I click here on the settings, I can click here to choose the HDRI, and I'm going to make it this really bright one, and then I'm going to turn up the strength so it's really bright. And that just makes it a bit easier to see all the grass because it's really bright. Now I also want to turn up the scale, so just for now I can turn up the scale values just like that so that it's a bit bigger and it's easier to see. Now there's a problem, and that is that it's distributing all of the grass together. So to make that not happen, we can click on separate children, reset children, and pick instance. And this way it's going to randomly pick different blades of grass, and you can see they're also going to be randomly different colors. Now we have this distance min value, and if I turn this down, it's just going to be randomly all around, and so some of the grass is kind of overlapping, but if I turn the distance min up, you can see there's going to be a minimum distance value between all the grass. So if you want to, you could turn up the distance min to a small value, maybe like a 0.1 or something, so there's a little bit of distance between each grass. I'm actually going to keep this at 0 because I don't mind if some of the grass is overlapping, because I want it to look like there's going to be little clumps of grass. And then I can turn up the density max, but just make sure you don't turn this up too high, because if you turn this up to a way too big number, then it will start to get kind of laggy in the scene. So you can say I just have this right now at like a 0.2. So let's now make the size of it a bit better. So if I just zoom into the house, you can kind of see the house compared to the grass. So what I can do now is click and drag down and then drag back and forth to change the scale values of all of them at once. So I'll turn this way down to something like that. That's a little bit better, maybe turn down a little bit more. Now what I also want to do is have random scale values per instance. So what we're going to do is search for the random value node, and we're going to put the value into the scale. So now I can change the maximum value and the minimum value. So maybe the maximum value I'll turn to like a 3.5, and the minimum I might turn this just to like a 0.1, change it to a 0.1. So that way some of them are as small as 0.1 and then other ones are as large as 3.5. So you can see there's a lot of variation now in the scale. Now I also want a bit of random rotation so that each one is rotated randomly. So what I'm going to do is just select these nodes and bring them over, and then I can duplicate the random value. Now here on the float, I want to change this to vector, and that way we have values for the X, Y, and Z axis. So the random value can now go into the rotation to control the rotation of the grass. Now let's first take the maximum value and we're going to turn that all to 0, and the bottom one is going to be the Z axis. So I can rotate this around randomly, and what I'm going to do is type in TAU. So TAU for tau, that's a math equation which will generate this value, which will make sure it's randomly rotated all the way around, or you can just turn it up to a giant number like 100 or 1000, so it's very random, but that'll be just fine. Now I can also rotate it a little bit on the x-axis and the y-axis, so I'm just going to turn these to a small number of maybe like a 0.2 and just a 0.2. So now they're just slightly randomly rotated kind of to the side. And then let's go back up here to the distribute points on faces, and I might turn this a bit more to like a 0.4, maybe even like a value of 1. That might be a little bit too much grass, so let's turn it down, maybe like a 0.6, or maybe just like a 0.5, just kind of get it to how you like. And also I think maybe some of the grass is slightly too big, so maybe I'll just turn the maximum to a 0.3, something like that is a bit better. And I'm going to drag the random value up here and this random value up here, and I'm just going to kind of compress the nodes just so the node setup looks a little bit nicer. Now what I also want to do is I want to weight paint where I want the grass to show up, because right now we have tons of extra grass that the camera's not even going to see. And we're also going to have this be kind of a thick forest, so in the background you're really not going to be able to see the grass. So let's go to the weight painting by changing object mode over to weight paint. So you can see it's blue, and if I start to paint, it's going to become more red. And if it's more red, there's going to be more grass in that area. And you can also change the radius and strength, and then you can paint along here. And then if you hold down the control key as you click, that's going to get rid of color. Now you can see the grass isn't really changing, and that's because we need to take the density factor and put that here into the group input. Now if we open up the side panel, we have this density factor, but we're going to click right here on the input attribute toggle, and this will allow us to choose the weight painting. So now if we click on the drop down, we can choose the point group right here. But real quick, if I open up the group right here, I'm going to double click on this to rename it, and I'll just call it grass, because we're going to be using a few different ones. So I'm going to be renaming the weight painting because we're going to be weight painting a few different layers of weight painting. So now here on the density factor, let's choose the grass instead. So now if I just kind of paint along here, you can see the grass is just showing up where we're painting. So I'm going to paint all along the riverbed, paint a lot of grass because I want the grass to be along the riverbed, but not in the water. So just kind of paint along here, and you can also leave a few spaces and a few gaps if you don't want any grass in some areas. Let's hit Control Spacebar to go into full screen, and then I can just go along here and just continue to paint just where I want the grass to be. You can also hit the 0 on the numpad to go into the camera view and just kind of see what the camera can see. Now we are going to be doing an animation, so the camera is going to move a little bit, so that's why I'm doing most of the entire surface here of the river. And then back here we can add a little bit of grass, but it's going to be a dense forest right here behind where the cabin is, so you're not going to be able to see it too well, so I'm not going to add too much grass there. Maybe a little bit more here on the riverbed and kind of around the cabin. All right, let's change from weight paint back to object mode. We can go into the camera view and let's just go into the rendered viewport mode. And there we go. We now have some nice little bits of grass there just along the side of the river. And back here, there's going to be a lot of trees, so we don't really need to paint back there. Let's click on back to previous, or you can hit Control spacebar to go out of full screen. So now I want to do pretty much the same exact setup, and we're going to be adding rocks instead. So let's go into the material preview. Now what I can do is I can copy the same geometry node setup because it's going to be very similar. So what I can do is click on add modifier, and we're going to add new geometry nodes. So add new geometry nodes to the ground. And on the drop down, we're going to choose GeoNodes Grass. But then I want to duplicate this so it's a separate node setup so it doesn't affect the grass. So we'll click on this button here, which looks like the paper icon. And then if I click on this to rename it, let's just rename it to Rocks. And just to make this a bit simpler, I think I'm just going to call this one Grass. And I'll call this one Grass. And then this here I'll call Rocks. So you have the grass and the rocks. So now what you want to do is just click here to make sure you select the rocks. So make sure this geometry nodes is now previewing the rocks. And what I can do is click here to delete the grass. And then just for now, to make sure it doesn't get too laggy, I'm going to turn this density here to just like a 0.01 so it's very small. So there's not very much grass. And then if I click here, let's just choose the rocks collection. So now you can see there's a bunch of rocks kind of randomly generated here. Let's just make this a bit smaller. So now I want to have a lot more rocks, and I also need to change the size. So let's take the distance min and maybe turn up to like a 1. So there's a little bit of space in between the rocks. And then I can just turn up the density max here, maybe to like a 0.4. That might be a little bit too many rocks, so maybe like a 0.3. And then we can also change the size. So on the maximum, let's change it down to maybe like a 2. Let's zoom in here. So those rocks are pretty good size, and then just a 0.1 as the smallest value, that's pretty good. Although some of the rocks are really small, so maybe I'll turn this up to like a 0.3, so some of the rocks are a little bit bigger. Now you can see that many of the rocks are at the exact same point as where the grass is, and that is because both the grass and the rocks are using the same seed value. So this is just a random value which will generate where it's going to be. So we'll turn the seed up to just a 1, and that way it's going to be placed at random points. So now I also want to weight paint this. So if I select the plane or the ground, let's click on object mode and we're going to go to weight painting. And you can see we still are using the grass. So let's click here on the grass. We're going to click on the plus here to add a new one, and I'll click on this and call it rocks. So now we just kind of paint along here where we want the rocks to be. And then if we open up the side panel, again, we're going to click on the input attribute toggle, and we're going to instead choose the rocks. So now I can just go along here and just paint again on the riverbed. You could use the same weight painting of the grass if you want to, but just to make it look a bit more random and different, I'm going to just use a different painting here for where the rocks are going to be. Maybe make some parts where there aren't any rocks and then parts where there's more rocks. I might want to add a bit more rocks, so let's turn the density max to like a 0.4. So just a little bit more rocks, or maybe even like a 0.5. Just kind of play around with it until it's how you like it. So let's add a few more rocks here and maybe a few here kind of behind the building. And we'll change this back to object mode. And there we go. We now just have a few little rocks here and there. And then I think I'll just turn the random value maximum to a little bit of a smaller number, like a 1.7 or maybe even a 1.5, so the largest rocks are a little bit smaller. I like that there are some areas where there's a lot more rocks and then other parts where there aren't very many. Now I also want to duplicate the same node setup, and we're going to be adding it here onto the river because the river is going to have the river rocks. So we'll select the river, let's click on add modifier, we can add geometry nodes, and then we'll click on the drop down here and here's the rocks, but I don't want to add the rocks yet. What I want to do is click on this monitor icon to hide the rocks because I don't want it to lag the scene too much. So now if we click on the drop down, we can choose the rocks, but you can't see them right now. What I'm going to do is just duplicate this node setup, so we'll click on the paper icon, and this one I can rename it to river rocks. And then let's go over here, and on the river rocks we can choose the collection, and we're going to change this to river rocks. And then here on the density max, I'll turn this to like a 0.01 so it's not too laggy. And then let's click on the monitor icon to show the rocks. So now what I can do is go back here to the random value, and let's turn this up so that some of the rocks are a little bit bigger, and also turn up the minimum value. And then I can also turn up the density max, but make sure you don't turn up too high because it'll get way too laggy. Now also, if this plane is smaller, there's not going to be quite as many rocks, so it'll make it less laggy. So if I go into edit mode, I think I will move the entire object over and then also scale it down on the y-axis, and we're just going to make it just big enough. So maybe go here to the edge select this edge and kind of drag this in a little bit, just like that to make it a little bit smaller. And of course, once we add the entire scene and do the animation, we can make it smaller if we need to. So let's go into the camera view, kind of zoom in here. So you can see we have those river rocks. Now on the random value, we have the rotation values, but I want to turn the X and the Y to 0 because I don't want them to be randomly rotated around because they have flat bottoms. So just like that. Now let's also change the random scale again. So these rocks I think should be a little bit bigger. So turn that to maybe a 1 and a 3 there. That's pretty good. I think a minimum and a maximum of 1 and 3 looks pretty good. And then there might just be a little bit too many rocks, so I might turn down the density max here. Just like that, and maybe even make the value a little bit bigger so some rocks are a little bit larger. And why I'm adding these little rocks popping out of the river is because I want this to look like a pretty shallow kind of calm river, so you're going to see a few rocks popping out of the river. So I don't want too many rocks, so I'm just going to go with a density max of 0.01 and a distance min of 1, and then here I'm going with a random value of 2 and 4 for the scale. So we just have a few rocks kind of along the river. So let's save the project again. Now if you're finding that your 3D scene is somewhat laggy, what you can do is just hide the geometry nodes from the viewport. So if you select one of the objects, you can click on the monitor icon to hide it from the viewport, and that way you can't see it in the viewport, but it'll still show up in the render. So if that's happening for you, if it's too laggy, you can just hide it, but I'm going to keep it showing because I do want to be able to see the geometry nodes. So now let's add the trees on the ground. So we're going to select the ground object. Let's click on add modifier. We can add geometry nodes. And then again, if we click on the drop down here, we're going to choose the grass. But first, let's click on this button here just to hide it from view, just in case it gets too laggy. So we'll click here and we're going to choose the grass. Then we're going to click on this icon here, the paper icon, to duplicate it, and we're going to call it trees and also call this trees. So now let's open up the side panel so we can kind of see this better. Make sure you are previewing the trees. And then here on the density max, I'll turn this to like a 0.01 so it's really small. And we're also going to delete the grass and we're going to choose the trees instead. So let's now click here to show the geometry nodes. And let's make this a bit smaller. We can make this smaller so we can just see the trees showing up. Now they're moving around way too much. So again, on the random value rotation, we're going to turn these values to a really small number of maybe just like a 0.05 and a 0.05 on the X and Y. So turn this one to a 0.05, and that way the trees will be rotating slightly, but pretty small. They're mostly just going to be rotating on the Z axis. Now you can also see some of the trees are really quite small and that doesn't look good. So let's turn up the minimum value and the maximum value. Let's turn them both to maybe like a 4 for now. Let's see how that's looking. That's a bit better of a size. So maybe the minimum value can be like a 3. So some of them are a bit bigger and some of them are a bit smaller. Maybe even turn the max to a 4.5. That's a little bit better. Maybe even turn the maximum to like a 5 so that some of the trees are quite large. Now I also want to turn up the distance min value. So if I turn this up, some of the trees will start to disappear because there's going to be more space in between each tree. So I might turn this to like a 3, something like that. So there's a little bit of space in between the trees. Maybe turn it up to like a 4. Or maybe even like a 5 because some of these trees are still overlapping a little bit. And then I can turn up the density factor, or I can turn up the density max, but I'm going to turn up very slowly because I don't want it to lag the scene too much. So I'm just going to turn up by a small amount. So maybe like a 0.04 is pretty good. So that looks like a pretty dense forest. So now I want to weight paint this. So we're going to select the ground and we'll go from object mode to weight painting, go to weight paint. And then if we click here on the rocks, we'll click on the plus here to add a new one, and we'll call this one trees. And now we can just go along here and start to weight paint. And then again, to make it show up, to make the trees just show up where we're painting, we're going to go here to the trees and we'll click on the input attribute toggle. And then we're going to click here and choose the trees. So now if I paint along here, you can see just the trees are showing up where we're painting. So we're going to make this pretty much all red because I do want this to look like a really dense forest. But then kind of on the river, kind of close to the river side, there's not going to be quite as many trees. But all along here, let's paint along here and pretty much paint red all along there. And especially behind the house, I definitely want a lot of trees behind the house. And you can hold down the control key and paint to get rid of color if you need to. Let's go into the camera view, kind of see how that's looking. I do like how that is. Let's change from weight paint back to object mode. We can also go into the rendered viewport mode to see how it's going to look in the rendered view with all the lighting. And that's looking really good, and I do definitely want it to be a pretty thick forest. It might just be a tiny bit too thick though, so if I open up the geometry nodes, I might turn the density max just a little bit to a smaller number, like a 0.03, so it's slightly less dense. So let's click back here to go to the layout, and I'm going to go out here, go back to solid view, and now what I want to do is duplicate the ground, and we're going to make another ground here farther back to make the forest look more dense, and then we're also going to have a background over here, and we're going to have kind of some hills with trees. So we'll select the object, and we'll duplicate it, and we'll move it over here, but then we don't need the rocks and the grass because they're going to be really small and far away. So if we click here to go to the modifiers, we want to delete the grass and delete the rocks, and we're just going to keep the trees. So we'll rotate this one by 90 degrees on the z-axis. Actually, I need to rotate it on the z-axis now by 180, so it's going the opposite way. So the riverbed is right there. So let's bring this over and kind of bring it back a little bit, pretty far away. You could even move the river forward a little bit if it's not far away enough. Let's go into the camera view. You can see now we have kind of a nice background with more trees. And I think it's not far enough away, so I'm going to bring this even a little bit farther back. And then if I go into edit mode on the ground object here, or the river object, let's scale it way up so that it's even bigger, because I don't want this to be pretty far in the background so that these trees in the background are pretty small. Let's go into the rendered view to kind of see how that's looking. And we can select this and kind of move it over kind of like that. And then we are going to have a few different camera angles, like one of the camera angles in the animation is going to be more in this view. So we do want to have kind of some trees over here because the camera will see that at a different angle. So we'll now select the object. Let's go into solid view, and I want to go into edit mode. And I'm going to just hit B for the box select and just box select the back here and click here to turn on proportional editing. And I'm just going to drag it out. And just kind of drag it out, scroll your mouse wheel to change the size of the proportional editing, and I'm going to make it a lot longer because I want it to look like a really dense forest. So you can see as I'm dragging this out, more and more trees are kind of showing up. So I'm going to kind of stretch it out so it's longer. And then I also want to make kind of like some hills. So if we go into the camera view, I want there to be a bigger hill over here, then it kind of goes down, and then another bigger hill here. So if I just select a face, just go to the face select and select a face, we can bring this up so it's a bit higher, kind of over here. And then over here, we can also bring a face up here. Let's select the back and kind of bring this up here, just so that we have kind of two hills. So it goes up and then down and then back up. All right, so now we're going to select this object again, and we're going to duplicate it. We're going to bring it forward and then bring it back. And again, on this object, we can delete the grass and delete the rocks because we don't need them. Let's go into edit mode, and I'm just going to box select some parts here on the back. So select these back parts, and we'll just bring them up on the z-axis. We're just going to bring up the back so that it's a little bit taller, so it kind of looks like there's a hill in the background. So just like that, move that over there. So now if we go into the camera view, you can kind of see there's going to be more in the background. And also one of the camera angles is kind of going to be like this view. So I just want a little bit of trees in the background just to make the forest look even more dense. We could also select everything, kind of scale it up on the X and Y to make it a little bit bigger. Just like that, so it looks like we have a big hill there with a really dense forest. Alright, so we're ready to do some of the animation. So I'm going to start by animating the river texture. Now for this animation, I'm going to have it be 500 frames. So the end frame here, I'm going to type 500 here on the timeline. So I'm now going to go to the shading workspace, and I'm going to select the river. Let's zoom into the river so I can kind of see it better. And also we need a timeline. So if you click in the corner when the crosshair appears, you can click and drag down and then click and drag over and then let go. And that is going to add that extra window there. And then click right here and we're going to change it to the timeline. Let's just drag it down, and we can also close this here. And now we can animate between frame 1 and 500. So what I want to do is I want to animate the W value, and then I also want to animate the location to make the river look like it's moving. So let's go into rendered view, and what I'm going to do is just hover my mouse over the W value and hit the I key to inset a keyframe. I'm now going to drag over here to the end, so go to frame 500, and on the W value, I'm going to turn this to like a 40, and then hit the I key again to add another keyframe. So now if I go back here and play this, you can see the ripples are just moving. Now I want to make sure this is linear, so it's moving at a consistent speed. So if I select everything, select the keyframes in the timeline, I'll hit the T key, and I'm going to choose linear for linear interpolation. So now when I play this, it's going to be moving at a consistent speed. You could also turn the strength up temporarily, just if you want to see how this is looking a little bit better, because it is pretty subtle. So you can see now that's just moving. If you want to scale it or change the speed of it, you can hit the S key in the timeline and you can scale up the keyframes. So now they're going to be moving a little bit slower. So if you want to kind of scale that up, I think I will scale it up so they're farther away. So now you can see that it's moving just a little bit slower. Now what I also want to do is I want to move the location, and I want to move the X location into the negative value. So it looks like the river is going down in this direction. So I'll go back to frame 0. I'll hit the I button with my mouse over the mapping location. Then I'm going to go here to the very end, just at frame 500, or you can go a little past 500. And I'm going to take the location X and I'm going to turn it to like a -40, and then hit the I key again to add a keyframe. So now if I play this, you can see the water is just slowly moving in that direction. Let's just zoom over to the cabin, or maybe zoom over here to the boat so you can kind of see it happening. So now you can see the water's moving in that direction. But it is moving a little bit fast, and also it's speeding up and slowing down at the starting and the ending. So if you select the mapping and also select the water, you can hit the A key in the timeline to select the keyframes, and we'll hit T and we're going to choose linear so that it's moving at a consistent speed. And then you can hit S to scale and just kind of scale the keyframes up just like that, so they're moving a little bit slower. And I think I want to scale up even more so it's moving a little bit more slowly. So now what I can do is go back here to the bump strength and I'll turn it to a really small number of 0.04, so it's going to be very subtle, but in kind of the reflections and things, you still can see the water moving. Let's hit Control S to save. So the next thing that I want to do is use Blender's Compositor to composite kind of that blue fog effect. So what we're going to do is click here to go to the Compositing, and let's just hit F12 to give this a render. We just want to render one image. All right, so there's the image. I'll hit the Escape key to go back. Let's click on Use Nodes, and now here's the render layers with that rendered image. And because we enabled the Node Wrangler, you can hold down the Control and Shift key and select the render layers, and that is going to add that backdrop there with the viewer. Now what I actually want to do is preview this in real time in the viewport. So what I'm going to do is hover my mouse here in the corner and I'll click and drag to split the window. And then if I click here to change the editor type, we'll change it to the 3D viewport. And I'm going to go into the rendered viewport mode and I'll go into the camera view, and then let's hide the gizmo, and we're also going to hide the overlays so we can't see any of the overlays. So this is what it'll look like in the camera's view. And also real quick, I'm going to click here to show the overlays and click on the camera. And let's click here to go to the object data properties of the camera, and we're going to open up viewport display, and we'll turn the passapar out all the way up to 1 so that it looks nice and black, and then I can hide the overlays. So that just makes it look a bit nicer so we can just see what the camera's going to see. And then we can also click on this button here to hide the backdrop. So now we just have the compositing nodes and the final image. So what I want to do now is I want to create a mist pass. We're going to be using a mist pass effect to create kind of that mist or fog. So just for now, let's go back to the layout and we're going to add the mist. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to click here to go to the view layer properties, and we're going to turn on the mist. So just check mark that. The next thing that we're going to do is click over here on the camera, and we're going to go here to viewport display, and we're going to turn on limits and also mist. This will make sure the mist works in the camera, and then also the limits here is going to give us this line here with these little dots. And so the starting of this dot here, that's going to be where the mist starts, and this one here is going to be where the mist ends. So now what we're going to do is go to the world properties, and if we close this here, we're going to open up the mist pass. And now we have a start and an end, and you can see the start and the depth. It's not actually end, it's depth, but the depth is going to be where it's going to end. So the depth is going to control this dot here, and then the start is going to control that dot. So I'm going to turn the start to 0 because I want to start at the very starting, and then the depth, I'm going to turn this really high, and I'm going to drag this really far so that it's kind of way over here. So it looks like for me, maybe like a 750 is pretty good. So maybe turn this up even a little bit more, like an 800. Turn it to 800. So now you can see it's going to end all the way over there. So let's go back to the compositing now. So we'll click here on compositing. So because we've added the mist, you can see now there is this mist right here in the render layers. If I put the mist up to the image to preview this and show backdrop, you can see it's fully black, and that's because we need to actually render it again. So we'll hit F12 to render, and that's going to render out the mist pass. And now we can hit the escape key to go back, and now you can see in the background we have this cool mist pass. So you can see as it gets farther farther away, it looks more white. So we're going to put the image into the viewer image. And now I just want to mix the mist pass into the image. So we're going to go to the add menu. We're going to search for an alpha over and drop it here. And we want to preview the alpha over, so stick it here into the viewer. Let's also hide the backdrop. And you can see that this rendered image here, or in the viewport, it's not actually showing up. The compositing isn't showing up. So if I scroll my mouse wheel over here, let's click here on the viewport shading, and we're going to change the compositor to always so we can see the compositing. So we're now going to take the mist pass, and we're going to put this into the factor. So now you can see this image here, this is going to be the color here. So the bottom image here will be the color of the mist. So I'm going to make it kind of like a strong blue color, something like that. And so the mist is going into the factor, so it's determining what part's going to be the blue color and what part is going to be the image. So now the background just kind of has that cool blue color. And if you want to use the same exact blue color that I'm using, you can punch in this hex value right here on the bottom image on the alpha over. Now I do want to edit this and play around with how it looks, so we can change the colors. So we're going to search for a color ramp, and we're going to put it here in between the mist pass and the factor. So now I can drag these tabs around. If I drag the white tab over, there's going to be more mist, or if I drag the black tab over, there's going to be less mist. Now what I want to do is change the colors. So on the black color here, I'm going to make this more of like a gray color, and that way there's going to be mist all over the entire image. And if you want to use the same gray color I'm using, you can punch in this hex value right here in that color ramp. And then this white tab, I'm going to drag the white tab over here. We can also make this a little bit bigger if you want to have better control of that. But you can see that if I drag this over too far, you basically can't see anything in the background. So on this white color, I'm going to make it a little bit darker. So just kind of like a light white color. And now you can see that the mist is kind of showing through, so you can see the clouds and the trees in the background. And again, if you want to use the same white color I'm using, you can punch in this hex value or just play around with it. So you can see there's less mist or more mist if it's more white or more black. Now what I also want to do is I want to add a bit of a glare. So I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to add a glare, and we'll put the glare in between the image and the alpha over. And on the streaks, I'm going to change this to bloom instead. Let's also turn the medium to high, so it's high quality, and then I'll turn the size up to 9. Now right now there isn't really anything which is really bright, so nothing is really showing up in the glare, but what we're going to do is we're going to add kind of like some glowing orbs in the scene, and then we're also going to make this lantern glowing. So let's add those glowing lights. So I'm going to click here to go back to the layout, and I'm going to zoom in here into the cabin. Let's just select the cabin, hit the period on the numpad to zoom into it, and we can just center the 3D cursor like right here. And I'll go to the add menu, and we're going to go to mesh and add an icosphere. And then we're going to shade the icosphere smooth, and we'll scale it way down, and we're going to stick the icosphere right in here, and let's hit the M key, and we're going to move it to the cabin collection. So there we have the icosphere, and let's now go into the rendered view to see how that's looking. And let's now add a simple material to this. So we're going to go to the material settings. Let's click on new to add a new material, and I can just call this light. And here on the surface, to make it be glowing, let's turn it to emission. Now here on the strength, I'm going to turn this up to 200 so it's really bright. And then I'm going to make this a nice bright orange color, and you can punch in the same hex value if you want to use the same color I'm using. So if we now go back to compositing, you can see we have this really cool light here, which is glowing right there on the front of the cabin. So that looks really nice. So let's go back here to the layout, and I'm going to go into the camera view, and let's select the camera. And I now want to create a focus object, and we're going to add a depth of field, and we're going to focus here on the cabin. So let's go to the camera settings. We'll go here to depth of field, turn on depth of field. And then what we can do is actually just click here on the lantern object. We're going to hit F2 to rename it, and we can call it lantern. So call it lantern. Now if we click here in the corner to select the camera again, and we can click on this focus object, and we can start to type in lantern, and we'll choose the lantern object. So now you can see it's focusing on the lantern, and you can drag the f-stop value down, and if you turn the f-stop down, you can see things in the foreground and the background are going to be pretty blurred. So I'm going to turn my f-stop value to a 0.2, and that way you can see in the background the trees are going to be blurred, and also really close up the river is going to be blurred, but then most things here are going to be in focus. And I also think having kind of a strong depth of field really adds to that cool kind of low poly style. So let's now add the animated orbs. So let's go back to solid view, and I first need to go to the add menu, and we're going to add a cube, and we're going to scale the cube up really big because the cube is going to fit all the orbs. Let's go into edit mode, and I can scale it on the y-axis, also scale it up on the x-axis, so it's filling up pretty much the entire scene. We'll go into wireframe and we'll scale it down. like that, so it's a little bit more thin. So now we have this cube here, which is covering the entire scene. Let's also hit Control A and apply the scale. So we now need to add a single orb object. So if we go to the add menu, we're going to go here and add an icosphere. And let's just bring the icosphere down. We're going to bring it down here, kind of down here on the bottom so you can't really see it in the scene. And we're going to also shade it smooth. Let's select both of the objects here that we just added. And we're going to hit the M key. We're going to move them to a new collection. And we're going to call this Orbs and click on Create. So now they're in their own Orbs collection. And I'll just drag this right up here. So just in case if you want to hide it, you can just easily hide it there in the outliner. Let's select this object. We're going to hit F2 to give it a label, and we can call it Glowing Orbs. So Glowing Orbs. Now we can go into the camera view, and we're just going to select the big cube, and we'll go into the rendered view. So we now want to add a particle system, and we're going to have the orbs kind of floating around. So we'll go to the particles, we'll click on the plus here to add a new particle system, and we can just call this Orbs, and call this one Orbs as well. Now let's go down here to the render tab, and instead of rendering as halo, we're going to render it as object. And then here on the object, we can just type in orb. And since we renamed it to Glowing Orbs, we can just add Glowing Orbs. Now also one other thing I forgot to do is I forgot to actually add a material to the orb. So let's just zoom in here to the bottom and select the orb. Let's go to the materials. We'll click on new to add a new material, and I can call it orb. And for this one, we're going to click on the principled BSDF, and we're going to change this to the emission. So it's emitting light. And for the color, I'm going to make it this bright orange color, and you can punch in the same hex value if you want to use the same value. And on the strength, I'm going to set it to 20. Let's go into the camera view and go up into the rendered viewport mode, and then I can just hit the spacebar to play this, and it's pretty hard to see because they're really small. If I go into wireframe though, you can kind of see all those little orbs there, and they are falling down. So let's make it a bit bigger. So if we go over here to the particles, if we scroll down here, we can turn up the scale randomness and also the scale to make it a bit bigger. Now on the size here, I'm going to turn it to a 0.1. So they're still pretty small, but in rendered view, you can see that a bit better now. And then also the scale randomness, I'll turn that to a 0.5, so some of them are more random. Now what I can also do is I can go to the render here and click on show emitter to turn this off, because I don't want to be able to see that cube there in the final render. And also if we go here to viewport display, let's turn off the show emitter so that it's disappeared. So now if I play this, you can just see there's a few little orbs here in the scene. Now I don't want them to just be falling down, I instead want them to be already in the middle of the scene. So if we go up here to emission and open up the source, right now the emit from is going to be faces, so it's going to emit from the top and bottom faces, but let's change it to a volume instead. And this way they're going to be emitted out on default in the volume. So if I just go into the wireframe now, you can see some of the orbs are starting in the very center of the cube because it's set to volume. So I want the orbs to already be in the scene when it starts. So on the frame start, I'm going to make it -1000. So it'll start 1000 frames over here in the timeline. And then the end frame, I want it to go through the entire animation. So I'm going to make it 1000. So they're not going to end for 1000. And then also here on the lifetime, I don't want the orbs to ever disappear. So on the lifetime, I'm going to change this to 10,000. So you can do a 10 with 3 zeros. So now if I play this, you can see they're just slowly falling through the scene. Now I also don't want them to be falling down. I instead just want them to be kind of moving around the scene, kind of look like they're floating. So let's scroll right down here, and we're going to go to the field weights, and on the gravity I'm going to change this to a 0.15. So this way the gravity will still be there, so they're falling down a little bit, but they're going to be falling down a lot slower, and they're going to look like they're floating. Now the entire animation is also just a little bit fast right now, so let's close all these settings so we can kind of see everything again. And we're going to open up the physics, and then we're going to open up the integration. And on this time step, I'm going to change it to a 0.02 instead of a 0.04, and that way it's going to play at half the speed. Now what we can also do is add a force field to make them kind of move around and look like they're kind of just floating. So here in the scene, we'll just go to the add menu, we're going to add force field, and we're going to add turbulence. So I'll just kind of scale this up and stick it right up here in the sky. And then if we go here to the physics settings, I'm going to turn the strength up to like a 50. So now when I kind of play this, you can see if I go back to the start and kind of play this, you can see they're not really falling quite as much. A few of them are even floating up higher, and they're just kind of floating around more randomly because the turbulence force field is kind of making them move around. You can kind of see like that one is just kind of randomly floating up there. So now if we select the physics again, and we're going to go here to the particles, I'm going to set the emission type just to 1000. That's the default. I think 1000 looks pretty good. I just want it to be pretty subtle and just have a few here and there. So let's open up the cache here and we can click on bake, and it's going to go through and bake all the frames. So now if I just play this, you can see it's baked, and that's also really important when you're doing the animation and actually rendering this. It is a good idea to always bake it. Let's click right over here to go to the compositing tab. And now if I just play this, you can just see there's just a few little glowing orbs here and there. So that just kind of makes it look more magical and mystical. There's just a few little glowing orbs kind of moving around the scene. So let's now animate the cameras. So I'll just go back here to the layout and we're going to select the camera. Let's just go back to solid view. We're going to animate the first camera. So let's drag this over here to the starting frame. And the camera's already in the first position. So I'll hit the K button and add location, rotation, scale. So I'm now going to go to frame 170. So what you can do is actually just go right here to the frame and type 170. And I'll now hit G to grab, double tap the Z key, and let's bring the entire thing in a little bit. We can also maybe rotate it slightly and kind of move it over like this. And maybe also just rotate it up a little bit. So hit R to rotate and then double tap the X key. You can kind of rotate it up, maybe bring it down a little bit, and then hit K and add location, rotation, scale. And we can now go back to the starting and then just play this, kind of see how that's looking. Let's select all the keyframes. We'll hit T and choose linear so that's playing at a consistent speed. And if you need to, you can go into the rendered viewport mode just to kind of see how that's looking. You could also click right here on the viewport shading and you can choose always on the compositor and just kind of see how that's looking. So we just have a simple animation of the camera just slowly moving into the scene. So now what I'm going to do is have it switch camera angles at 170. So I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate. We'll duplicate the camera, select all the keyframes, and we'll hit X and delete them. And then we're going to go one frame back by using the arrow keys. So we're going to go to 169. We're going to select the first camera and hover our mouse in the timeline here and press Ctrl B to add a camera marker right there. Then we're going to go one frame over to 170. We're going to select the new camera and with our mouse in the timeline hit Ctrl B. So now if I go into the camera view by hitting the 0 on the numpad, I can go back and you can see at frame 170 it's going to move over. So now what I'll do is hit N for the side panel and we're going to click on camera to view, and I can now just move this to the second camera angle. So the second camera angle is going to be zoomed in here so you can kind of see the boat and the house and everything. So like that, and it's going to kind of slowly move throughout the scene. So I'm going to move it kind of to about there, and then I can close the camera to view. I'll hit the K button and add location, rotation, scale, and we're going to go to frame 320. So you can type right here 320, and then if you want to, you can turn on camera to view or just move it around however you want. And I'm going to move the camera, kind of zoom in a little bit and move it like there. Something like that. You can of course change this later if you want to. Hit the K button, location, rotation, scale. I can go back to the starting and play this, and then I'll select everything, hit the T key, and choose linear. So I think it might be moving a little bit too fast. So if I just select the keyframe, I can drag the keyframe out, and now it's going to be moving a little bit slower. Let's go into the rendered viewport mode, just to kind of see how that's looking. So it's just slowly moving through the scene. And now at frame 320, it's going to switch to the last camera. Now I forgot to turn off the camera to view, so turn that off. And then if I play this, it's going to jump back here because it's using keyframes. So let's go to frame 320. So just go to 320. We're going to duplicate the camera. We're going to delete the camera's keyframes. Then we're going to select this camera. So the second camera, we're going to go one frame back to 319 and we'll hit Ctrl B. Then we'll go over to 320. We'll select the last camera and hit Ctrl B. So now if I go into the camera view, it switches to the last camera. So now we can just animate the last camera. So another way to move the camera around is to hit the Shift tilde. The tilde button is above the tab key. It has that little swirl or kind of that little swiggle icon. So you can hit Shift tilde and then you can use the WASD keys and you can kind of move the camera around like a video game. You can also scroll your mouse wheel forward and that's going to make it go faster. And I can just kind of move this around or use the arrow keys. And this is another nice way to kind of move the camera around if you don't like where the camera is, or if you just need to pose it. Now, there is a problem here, and that's that there's all these trees here. So let's just get rid of these trees real fast. So let's just select the ground. We'll go to weight paint, and then I'll hold down the control key, make sure you're using the trees, and I'll just weight paint this away because I don't really want trees right there. So that's a bit better. We'll go back to object mode. Let's go into the camera view, go to object mode, and I'll hit Shift tilde And the last camera here, I'll just move it right about here. So I want to be looking out here into the trees kind of in the background, something like that. And then I just want to slowly move it forward into the scene. So let's just go into the rendered view. I like how that is. So make sure you're on frame 320 and I'll hit the K button and add location, rotation, scale. And then I can go all the way over to the last frame, so 500. I'll hit G to grab, I'll double tap Z, and then I can drag it forward like that. And I can also maybe rotate a little bit, maybe rotate it up a little bit. And it looks really blurred, but for the last camera, we're going to fix that blur issue. So like that, hit K, location, rotation, scale, and then select the keyframes, hit T, and we're going to choose linear interpolation. So now the camera's just slowly moving throughout the scene. Now it's really blurred, so let's go back to solid view. What we're going to do is just go right over here to the end, and you can place the 3D cursor like right there. Then we'll hit Shift A, and we're going to add an empty, and we're going to add a sphere empty. Let's hit F2 to rename this, and we can call this third camera focus. Third camera focus, and let's hit M, and we're going to move it into the scene collection. So now I need to just drag the empty right down here, kind of drag it over, and we're going to stick it here on the riverbank. So right here, just on the bottom there next to that tree, let's go into the camera view. Let's actually move it over here and then drag it back a little bit right there. So now if we go to the last camera, we can select the camera. We can open up the side panel and go to the object data properties. And instead of the lantern, we're going to start to type in third camera, but you can see it's right here. So third camera focus. Let's go into rendered view. And now you can see that the cabin is kind of blurred, but the background is in focus. Now on the f-stop here, I'm going to turn this up to like a 0.5 because I do want it to be a little bit more in focus. So now you can see it's just a little bit blurred, but then the background is nicely focused. And I like that kind of hill there at the end. Although one more quick thing, I do think that this last camera is moving a little bit too fast. So you can select the keyframes and pull them farther apart. And that way they're going to be moving just a little bit slower. That's a little bit better. I think it was just moving a bit too fast. So now we're going to animate the boat. So we'll go back to solid view. Let's just select the boat and let's hit the period on the numpad to zoom into it. And I'm going to select the two paddles first and then shift select the boat. I'll hit Control P and we're going to set parent to object keep transform. So now I can just move the boat and the paddles will move with it. So let's go back to the starting frame and I'll hit the K button. Let's actually first move it down a little bit and then I'll hit K and we'll add location, rotation, scale. We're now going to go over by 50 frames. So go to frame 50 and I'll hit G to grab and bring it up on the Z axis. So it's a little bit taller or it's a little bit higher. And then I'll hit K and add location, rotation, scale. So it just slowly kind of bobs up and that's actually probably a little bit too far. So bring it a little bit more down and then K, location, rotation, scale to override that keyframe on frame 50. So now you can see it's pretty subtle, but it just kind of bobs up. So let's now take the first keyframe and we'll duplicate it and stick it here at frame 100. And then if we hit the A key to select all of them, we can duplicate them and we're going to stick it over this one. So basically this keyframe here is going to be overriding this keyframe because it's on top. And now if I play this, it's just slowly bobbing up and down every 50 frames. So we'll duplicate all the frames, put them right over there, duplicate all the frames again and stick it right there. So now throughout the entire animation, you can see it's just bobbing up and down. So that's just going to add a nice little detail to the animation. All right, so we are almost ready to render this out. Now, one thing that I want to do is I want to turn on motion blur. So here on the render settings, if I just go down here to motion blur, I can just turn this on. Now, one problem with the motion blur is that when we're simulating the orbs moving around, because we simulate the orbs into the negative value, they're going to move really fast at frame 1. And so there's going to be basically a bit of a blur. So if I just render out frame 1, you can see because we have on this motion blur, there's going to be these little lines here and that really doesn't look that nice. And again, that's because it's kind of simulating it in the negative values and then it jumps really fast over to frame 1. So there's going to be these little lines here. So what I'm going to do to fix this is simply just not render frame 1. So on the start frame, I'm going to turn it to 2. So now at frame 2, the motion blur, that motion blur issue is going to be fixed. We're just not going to render frame 1. So technically it'll be a 499 frame animation. So let's now click over here to go to the output properties. And I'm just going to render this at 1920 by 1080 so it renders a bit faster. For the final animation, I did render a bit higher resolution just for YouTube because I record my videos higher resolution, but you can just render it with 1920 720 by 1080. Now here in the file format, you could set it to PNG if you want to, but I'm going to set it to JPEG because the file size will be a lot smaller, and then I'll turn the quality to 1. Let's now click on this file icon to set a folder to save our images. And here in my project files, I'm just going to click on that plus there to add a new folder. I can just call it frames. I can go into the folder and then click on accept. So it'll render out all the frames to that folder. So just hit Ctrl S to save the project again, and then we'll click on render and we'll render the animation. All right, so it's finished rendering. So I'll just save the project again, and then I'll open up a new video editing file. So I'll click on file, I'll go to new, and I'll go to video editing. So now here in the sequencer, I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to add the image and sequence. Just locate to the folder with the files, I'll go into the frames and just hit the A key to select all the frames, and I'll click on add image strip. Now we want to set the end frame, but remember we didn't actually render the first frame. So the end frame is going to be 499 instead of 500. So you can see now that's going to be the very end frame. So now we can just play through this and watch the final animation. So now to really make this animation a lot nicer, I'm going to have it fade in and fade out, and we're also going to add some sound effects and music. So link is in the video description if you want to download the 3 sound effects that I'm going to be using. So I'm first going to be adding the bird sound effect. Let's just drag this over here, and you won't be able to hear it in the video because I turned off my computer audio, but this is the bird sound effect. I'm going to turn down the volume to like a 0.5, maybe even a little bit smaller, like a 0.3, because I don't want it to be too loud. And then we can also add in this cool forest wind sound effect. And then this one, definitely I'll turn it way down to like a 0.1. So it's a lot more subtle. So just kind of adds a subtle ambience. And then I'm also going to add this river flow sound effect. Now this one is way too loud, so I'm going to turn it down to like a 0.1. And then I also want it to be going a lot slower, so it sounds like the water isn't moving as fast. So what I'm going to do is open up this time right here, and I'm going to click on show retiming keys. Then I can click here to select the keyframe, and I can drag this keyframe out, and this is going to make the sound effect play slower. So it's kind of going to play in slow motion, so it just sounds like the water is moving slower. And I'm going to turn the volume to maybe like a 0.05, so it is really subtle. And maybe some of these just turn down the volume a little bit more, because I think it was a little bit too loud. All right, and then finally I'm going to add in the ambient music that I downloaded from filmmusic.io. So again, you can download it with the link in the description if you're interested. I'm just going to drag it over here, and I'm going to turn it way down to maybe like a 0.3. So it's a little bit quieter, maybe a 0.2. And I kind of like to have it start playing kind of around here. So now what I can do is I can fade in and out the audio. So what I'm going to do is kind of play over here to maybe like a couple seconds into the animation. And then with your mouse hovered over the volume, you can hit the I key to add a keyframe. Then you can go back to the starting, turn the volume to 0, and hit the I key. So now you can see it's just going to fade in the music. So I'm going to do the same thing for all the sound effects. So hit the I key, go to the starting, turn the volume to 0, and then hit the I key again to add a keyframe so it fades in. The same thing for this one here. Go to the starting, turn this down to 0 and add a keyframe. And the same thing for the birds. So just add keyframes so everything fades in. And then we can do the same thing for the video. So what I might do is just drag the video over a little bit so it starts as black. And then here at the very starting, we'll turn the opacity to 0. Hit the I key to add a keyframe. We'll just play maybe a second or two and then turn the opacity up and hit the I key. So now you can see everything just fades in. All right, let's just go here to the very end, and then we can just have it kind of fade out right over here. And I actually want to turn the end frame up a little bit longer now because we kind of moved it over, so there was a little bit of a black spot at the starting before it fades in. Let's go here to the very end, and I can just hit the I key on the opacity. We can go to the very end here, turn the opacity to 0, and then hit the I key again. So I'm just going to do the same thing for these other sound effects. So we'll do that for the music, kind of have the music slowly fade out. We'll add keyframes here to all the sound effects. Go to the end and just turn all these sound effects down to 0 and add keyframes. So now when I play this, you can see here there's that little bar graph, and it's kind of showing us that everything is fading out and the music is fading out. So there we go, that is it for the animation. So I'll just save this video editing file. So I'll click on File and Save. I'll just save this as Video Edit in the project files and click on Save Blender File. And then let's scroll right down here and we can go to the output and we will set a folder to save it. And I'll just save it in my project files and click on Accept. And right here I can add a name and I can just call it Final Video. Then here on the file format, I'll use FFmpeg video. On the encoding, I'll use MPEG-4, video codec of H.264, medium quality and good, and then for the audio, I'm going to set this to AAC. So just save the file again, and you can click on render and render the animation. So with that all finished, this is going to wrap up the tutorial series on how to create this low poly stylized forest river animation. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial series, and if you'd like to help support me and this YouTube channel, you can also purchase the finished tutorial project files with the links in the description. And if you want to learn how to create some more nature tutorials, then I do have a nature tutorial playlist, so you can watch some more of my nature tutorials and learn how to create some nature scenes and nature animations. And if you're interested in creating more low poly renders and low poly artworks, then I do also have a low poly tutorial playlist, so if you'd like to check out those playlists, I'll have them there on the end screen and also the links in the video description. So I hope you enjoyed the tutorial series, and thank you for watching.